So ANZPATH would like to thank Mr. Tim Wilson, Australia's Human Rights Commissioner, for agreeing to open the conference. Mr. Wilson was appointed the Commissioner for Human Rights by the Prime Minister in February this year. He's an international public policy analyst specialising in international trade, health, intellectual property and climate change. He was recognised by the Australian newspaper as one of the 10 emerging leaders of Australian society as part of its 2009 Next 100 series. He was also recognised by Same Same as one of Australia's 25 most influential gay and lesbian Australians in 2010. Would you please welcome the Commissioner to the podium? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. As introduced, my name is Tim Wilson. I am Australia's Human Rights Commissioner, and the words came directly from my website, which is probably why I think they're so kind as well. Before I begin, I just want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which we meet today, the Kunara people, and I pay my respect to their elders, both past, present and future. I want to say how fantastic it is to be here today, and in particular to see so many bright, happy faces on a Saturday morning to talk about substantive matters that affect people and that have real consequences. Because behind human rights issues are, of course, human stories about people's capacity to live their own lives, pursue their opportunities and their enterprise, and we need to preserve and protect those stories and, because of that, their lives. It's an immense pleasure to provide the opening address at the 3rd ANZPATH Biennial Conference, Clinical, Service, Science and Community. I am greatly encouraged by the goals of the ANZPATH Conference, promoting excellence in clinical service, strengthening the Australian transgender community and improving the relationship between these two groups. I also hold sincere hope that this 3rd Biennial Conference meets its objectives of providing an opportunity to bring together those who advocate best practice and supportive policies promoting the health, rights and well-being of transgendered people in Australia and, of course, in our neighbour across the ditch, New Zealand. Now, before I start, I want to make a quick note regarding terminology. I want to acknowledge that as Commissioner, and the Commission recognises that terminology can have a profound impact on a person's identity, self-worth and inherent dignity. The use of inclusive and acceptable terminology empowers individuals and enables visibility of important issues. The Commission supports the right of people to identify their sexual orientation, sex and gender as they choose and see fit. I'm sure many of you may share my pleasure to have heard about the recent decision by the High Court, upholding that the Births, Deaths and Marriages Registration Act 1995 in New South Wales permits the registrar to register a person's sex as non-specific. This ruling is in line with the findings and recommendations of the Commission's 2009 Sex Files report on the legal recognition of sex in documents and government records. These developments were not just important for the individual concerned, of course, though it very much was. It was important because it established that it wasn't the role of government to tell people who they are. It's the role of government to respect who people are. Furthermore, the Commission's 2009 Sex Files report directly informed the 2013 Australian Government Guidelines on Sex and Gender Recognition. These guidelines require all federal government agencies to provide a 3rd option to the male-female binary categories across all relevant data collection points, and in addition articulate strict controls on the use and confidentiality of gender-based data collection. On this note, the Commission also recognises that terminology is strongly contested. As many of you here are all too aware, issues concerning sexual orientation are quite different to issues concerning sex and/or gender identity. For the purposes of my speech today, I will be using the acronym SOGI, or Sexual Orientation, Gender Identity and Intersex Status, to refer to the group of rights we are discussing, and of course LGBTI, which I'm sure you're all familiar, to refer to the people and identities and experiences of the rights of those that are impacted. So why am I being invited to speak on SOGI rights today? Barely 6 months ago, the Governor-General appointed me as Australia's 6th Human Rights Commissioner to be based out of the Australian Human Rights Commission. Like all national human rights institutions, the Commission was established under relevant federal legislation and is part of Australia's commitment to protecting, fulfilling and respecting human rights. There are currently 7 commissioners at the Commission, which include the President and commissioners that focus on discrimination on the basis of age, sex, race and disability. There's also the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner and the Children's Commissioner. And then there is the Office of the Human Rights Commissioner, which differs from the other commissioners' portfolios that provide specific focus through relevant pieces of federal legislation. As many of you will be aware, there is no dedicated commissioner in a formal capacity to dealing with SOGI rights. While much good work has been done in the past by the Commission, there has never been a commissioner explicitly responsible for spearheading a SOGI agenda. My arrival as Human Rights Commissioner has provided this opportunity, and I want to make it clear that is a role that I take on with great enthusiasm and interest. As Australia's first openly gay Human Rights Commissioner, I welcome the opportunity to utilise my public position to advocate for the realisation of SOGI rights in the federal context as well as across the states, and that is what we have been doing. But the Commission does have a proud history that I do not want to overlook. Throughout the 2000s, the Commission undertook a public consultation to canvass the experiences and views of people who may have been discriminated against on the basis of their sexual orientation or gender identity, or because they are intersex. The results of this constitution, as with the Same-Sex Entitlements Inquiry in 2007, and the Sex Files report in 2012, contributed to significant law reform in Australia spanning from relationship recognition to anti-discrimination protection. And as we gather here to begin the process of exploring best practice for transgender rights, health and well-being in both Australia and New Zealand, it is of particular note that transgender and intersex people in Australia are even further disadvantaged than normal Ls, Gs and Bs that we discuss in that acronym. During my short time at the Commission, it is this area, the area of gender identity and sex diversity, in which I have learnt the most, and I make no, seek to try and hide it. And the more insight I have gained, the more I am convinced of the need for serious attention related to discrimination and inequality challenges under the law experienced by transgender and intersex Australians. On this note, my approach to pursuing SOGI human rights is firmly founded in my approach to human rights more generally. Within my role, I approach human rights from a classical liberal perspective, that human rights are the protection of the individual from the abuse of government power, that people own their own lives and should be free to pursue their opportunities and their enterprise, while of course ensuring they do no harm to others. For the rights of transgender and intersex people, this approach holds specific implications. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights enshrines the rights of all people to non-discrimination and equality before the law. The right to equal protection of the law without discrimination requires state parties to prohibit discrimination and take action to protect against discrimination. A number of UN committee decisions and statements have confirmed that this right to non-discrimination extends to sexual orientation and gender identity. In Australia, thanks to sustained efforts of an impressive collective and dedicated lobby of LGBTI communities and individuals, we have benefited from substantial and sustained law reform in this area, but we are not at the end of that process. We no longer face laws that criminalise consensual homosexual activity, as we know. And of course, it was the 1997 decision by Tasmania to decriminalise sex between consenting adults, which saw the last of those provisions removed. In addition to the decriminalisation of male homosexual activity, Australia now enjoys extensive federal same-sex relationship recognition, although that process is also not done, as we're well aware, and more recently, new federal anti-discrimination legislation, protection and substantial policy reform, including the recent federal guidelines on sex and gender recognition. Of course, marriage for same-sex couples continues to be an issue. And of course, it has a very big impact on those who are married but may go through a gender affirmation process. But no one doubts that it is inevitable. It is simply a process that we need to work ourselves through. However, substantial legislative challenges still exist for transgender and intersex people in Australia as separate from LGB law reform. For example, transgender people still face a struggle in achieving recognition for their chosen gender across a myriad of bureaucracies in this country, battling various conflicting standards for passports, driver's licences, marriage recognition and birth certificates. Equally disturbing, the issue of non-consensual surgical intervention for intersex people and children remains an issue here as well, and we are working at the Commission on all of these matters. Often we get lost talking about the mechanics of legal and policy change, but it's through understanding the experiences of people, through things like discrimination, vilification, harassment, that we can really appreciate the importance of equal treatment under the law. Discrimination in particular can have a very real impact in terms of people's capacity to participate in the rest of society, and this is not something that has been lost on me at all. Law can only take us so far though. Law is the line between legality and illegality. It can have a modest educative effect, but after law there is so much more to do. It must come through a lived culture of respect and tolerance for others to see a fulfilment of people's rights and responsibilities. Now, I obviously don't have to tell this audience why sharing best practice knowledge, building connections, as well as forging new partnerships and programs to tackle transgender health and rights matters. The data on the rights, health and well-being of transgender people in Australia and across the world speaks for itself. From the comparatively small data we have, we know, of course, that transgender people in Australia face higher rates of both institutional and social discrimination, as well as a number of other challenges in both law and policy. And last night, of course, I was talking to people at a drinks function specifically about the ongoing challenges faced by children or minors under the age of 16 who seek to access hormone treatment after puberty blockers, and the costs and legal implications and the structures that exist that restrict their capacity to do so. Something I'm very interested in seeking change and will be acting on as soon as I get back to work on Monday. And still, I am constantly impressed with the innovation, the commitment and resilience, despite these barriers, of those advocates for the transgender community. I've had the privilege of meeting so many people so far on my journey as Human Rights Commissioner, and I certainly hope to meet many more of you throughout today. As part of my role as Human Rights Commissioner and seeking to effect change in a lot of these policy areas, we are currently undergoing a national consultation, working with groups in the area of SOGI to get a full understanding of exactly where both legal but non-legislative barriers exist within Australian society today. Not just in terms of looking at the inconsistencies around issues like anti-discrimination law, but also looking at where there are those institutional barriers that come as a consequence of identity documents, and of course with relation to the medical components as well. After that, we're also looking at what programs and activities are being run across the country that seek to engage people, to have a culture of rights and responsibilities, that seek to promote understanding and awareness of the need for tolerance and respect for others, regardless of an individual's personal circumstances. If you have ideas, submissions or things you would like us to consider or you do not think we are considering, Siri May, who's here, the stunning Dane over in the corner, can be contacted throughout the next 3 days to provide information if you cannot find me. And before I'd conclude, I really want to acknowledge the contribution, the participants of this conference that have made such an enormous contribution in their own right to an inclusive society in Australia today. Many of you work in circumstances that present challenges far beyond the realm of many Australians. I hold much admiration for your commitment and your courage and perseverance for a diversity agenda. The reality is it often isn't easy to work in some of these areas which are perceived as sensitive or lack public sympathy. It takes courage. Courage you have all shown either because you have an interest or because it's through your own lived experience, and you deserve incredible acknowledgement for your efforts. Standing up and standing out isn't easy, and it too often falls on the shoulders of too few. That's why people rightly say leadership is lonely, because it requires you to stand up free of the pack and carry a burden, to take risks and bear the consequences, and often in very difficult circumstances, and often in outside of capital cities or where you have few allies. You are all showing that leadership, and you should be proud of your achievements. As Dina Fetus from the US-based Human Rights Campaign recently said specifically on the issues being faced in the LGBTI acceptance space in the United States, if we learned anything from the equal rights movement, it's that legislation and policies are not enough. There has to be an actual culture of inclusion. That's the hard bit. A culture of inclusion, whether in clinical practice, public policy, societal attitudes or law, is a long and sometimes endless road. Conferences such as this represent another important and significant step on the road toward a more perfect and inclusive Australian society. And I wish you the very best over the next few days. I know some people sometimes voice frustration around the issues that are faced by people who are seeking change and policy change and legal change for transgender people. But I always say that it may have taken us a few thousand years to get onto the starting blocks, but I genuinely believe we are on the starting blocks. May the rest of this day and the next couple of days be a very important step in running that marathon. Thank you.